Hello again. I'm Mark Pennell, along with Paul Sartorelli. He's the lead pastor at Trinity here in Mentor. It's a nice day outside, by the way.
And we're in Ohio, by the way, and it's a nice day.
Rare. Okay, we're going to talk about next fellowship in how is your soul. But before we do, I mentioned we were talking about solitude last week, and I kind of overlooked something, and it was really hit home on Saturday. You had to do a funeral, a very tragic day, because she was only 44 when she died. It was an accident. And I was with the rest of the crowd. There were hundreds of us, people against the wall. Everyone was dealing with it, and there was a lot of weeping. You could hear it.
Yeah, there really was.
And it was probably the most intense funeral I've ever been to.
One of my most as well. I mean, young lady, she was a school teacher. A lot of her students and former students were there. And like Mark said, it was a hard day, painful day. And so what's your point?
Okay, I'm sitting on the front row, but way over on the left of Paul. And I'm looking around. I have a good viewpoint, shall we say, of the crowd around us. And there was something we all had in common. There was something that, however small it was, there was a comfort there in knowing that she was with her Father in heaven. We all knew that. And we were having a silent fellowship, shall we say, without even discussing it with one another. There was something in common that we all had. But I saw you right there in front of me. I could see your side profile, and you were alone. And
it's a lonely job.
Well, you really did an incredible job of keeping the whole thing going smoothly and all, but there was a lot of pressure on you. But the reason I bring this up is we had fellowship at that point, and in a way you didn't.
Well, in a sense I did. Let me say two things about it. I didn't know he was going to start with this, but that's fine. When we talk about how is your soul, that even in a time of lamenting and mourning, the soul is in pain, but it can still be healthy, if that makes sense. Right. It can be, because life is nothing if not filled with pain. I sound like Buddha, but he was right in that sense. Yeah, right. And yet, if I'm doing the things that are taking care of my soul, even the pains and the laments of life will not have total control or victory over my soul. Right. So I'll say that part. So there was a bit of soul time in that funeral service. And we're going to talk about fellowship because that's what Mark is talking about. There's also something about the fellowship at that moment. Mark and I were at a church that years ago, he and I were a part of.
He was the founder of the church, by the way.
We have since moved in different directions. And yet there were people that I hadn't seen for many, many years. Yeah. And the depth of fellowship was there as well. And so we are talking about the various elements that are important disciplines, I'll say, for the condition of our souls. Last time we talked about solitude, and this time we're going to talk about fellowship. Next time we'll talk about service. How these three disciplines, and we learn them from the example of Christ, are absolutely essential for the health of our souls. Can I read that passage?
Sure.
This is where we're getting it from. Jesus, I'm in Luke chapter 6, and in the first part of Luke chapter 6, Jesus is busy, he's harried, he's even healing on the Sabbath, and people are mad at this guy. And I think Jesus is at wit's end. The verse 11 of Luke 6 ends this way, as so many people are giving him such a hard time for healing people on Sabbath. I mean, you healed somebody? It's not thank you. It's like, yeah, but look what day it is. Verse 11 says, those that were opposing Christ, were filled with rage and started discussing with one another what they might do to Jesus. You ever feel that way? You feel like life is just filled with rage against you? Yeah. Well, here's what Jesus does. So during those days, I'm in Luke 6:12. So during those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray and spent all night in prayer with God. So discipline number one that we've been talking about on how is your soul, sometimes you just need to get away. Jesus spent all night. And if he needs to, maybe I do too.
I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know what I'd say all night. I'd love to be able to do it. I love being with him, but there's Because I'm not that deep of a guy. I don't know.
Or, I mean, we've taken people on silent retreats before.
Yeah.
And I've known some guys that went on these retreats, and you know what they did most of the time?
What?
They slept.
What?
Yes, but that's okay. Our souls and our bodies are not disconnected, and that might have been their body telling them, "Man, you've been redlining for way too long, and now is a time for both physically and spiritually for you to just take a really, really long nap." And I think that's okay. And it doesn't say Jesus didn't. Well, it does say he spent all night in prayer. So that's the solitude. Secondly comes the fellowship. When daylight comes, Jesus summons his disciples, and he chooses 12 of them to be his apostles.
Yes.
And that's where we're going to go today, basically saying Jesus created a ring of fellowship, people that he could pour his life into, who he could interact with, so that he wasn't alone in his work. That's fellowship. Then the third one, what do? After he chooses the 12, the passage then names the 12, and then it says, and after coming down with them, those 12, he stood on a level place with a large crowd of his disciples and a great number of people from all Judea. They came to hear Jesus and to be healed of their diseases, and those tormented by unclean spirits were made well, and the crowd was trying to touch him. So the third aspect that I think is really good for our souls is that we serve other people. We serve the needy. And I think that's really vital. We'll get into that the next show. This show, number 2, what's important for our souls is fellowship. Solitude followed by fellowship. So let's deal with fellowship.
Okay. The first thing I think of when I think of is 12 that he picked. But if you just look at it, my relationship with you is very different than my friend Bruce and my wife, of course. But I'm saying that each one of us have different relationships. So each one of those 12 people, he had a different relationship with some, the one he loved is mentioned in John, and it was probably John.
Yes.
Then there's Peter, who was kind of like a dog on a leash, and he loved Peter, probably smiled a lot about what Peter would say. And then all of them, of course, and then Judas.
Yes, right.
So I think it's wonderful when he picked them, he was picking around a well-rounded group or so. And that helped him get through the daily life. They protected him from the mob sometimes, but sometimes they forced him upon other people. It was interesting to see how he and his disciples was such a great dynamic.
And I would say that dynamic developed over the 3 or so years that he had with them. And he needed them. And they needed him. And part of our conversation is we need that. Our souls need that, to be able to be with people, again, using this passage almost as a trampoline to talk about our fellowship, to have people with common belief, common souls, so that fellowship is more than just macaroni and cheese at the church with a bunch of people or a cup of coffee at Starbucks. It can include that, but fellowship truly is those people, and it's soul to soul. It's heart to heart. It's that kind of fellowship, that kind of community that we need to have with each other. And that's in a sense, that's our premise. Even though we might not know we need it, we absolutely need it. And it's more than just presence, you with me. It's a growing presence, like it was with these guys.
I've always felt a little bit, I feel very much unqualified to do this particular program because I'm not very good at fellowship. Not that I don't want to be, but I'm so picky with my friends. Either you're with me or you're not. Well, that's not right, obviously, but that's just the way I am. So if you're kind of like that, this really does, fellowship is an amazing thing. If you're not a believer in Jesus Christ, I hope you're watching this with some question as to whether or not it's a good idea. Well, here's something to add to it. When you have friendship with people who are believers, there is a level that is such greater than any other friendship you've ever had.
If you allow it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't. There's a lot of people that are believers that are in churches right now that still have no idea what you're talking about, because it's either all in their heads. They go to a Bible study and it's just knowledge, or it's just superficial. There's no depth whatsoever. And so some people experience a bit more of the interpersonal depth of what we're talking about, maybe at the local bar, than some people do at the local church, because they don't allow the depth of the souls to get into it. And I think that's important to be heard.
Sometimes I think as believers, we're automatically expected to be sinless. Just, we know Jesus, now we're perfect. So there's somewhat of a standoffishness, if you can, around other believers if you don't know them very well. I would even call it snobbery. I've been with people many times that after a conversation with them, I realize that they think that maybe I'm not as good of a Christian as they are, and they don't want to have it. So if we lower that, if we get rid of that kind of thinking, then we can have a real deep relationship with each other who are in the same relationship with Jesus.
Let me give you a really important quality with fellowship. Grace. You better have grace in that fellowship, because what often happens is, let's say you're not regularly in solitude or in fellowship with the Lord. And so your soul is still a bit hungry. And so you're not getting the affirm grace from God. You're not getting yourself identified by God. So you get your identity in your solitude from Christ. You get your grace from Christ. You get your imperfections forgiven in Christ. And so ideally, now you come into fellowship with your soul in pretty good intact. So I'm not looking for that from you. However, we often aren't that way. We haven't spent time alone with our Father. So now I'm trying to get affirmed from you. And I'm trying to get forgiven from you. And I'm trying to get my identity from you, and all of those things. And you can't give it to me.
Right.
You can't tell me who I am. You can't give me God's grace. And so because you can't, you're not God. I need to forgive you, because you're going to disappoint me, just like I'm going to disappoint you. And one of the key elements of fellowship is the ability to give grace and to forgive and forgive and forgive. Because what you've said, we're a bunch of imperfect people, impossible people trying to establish an imperfect relationship, which is this fellowship. And you better have grace if you're going to survive that fellowship. And I'll tell you, the people that often don't survive it are the ones that church hop from this church to that church to this. That church didn't meet my needs. That church didn't. And it doesn't work that way.
No. I think something else about fellowship that can be a little bit scary is whether secular or as a Christian, is that a good example. I was with Paul. We were taking our Saturday morning walk one time, and I brought up somebody that I didn't particularly like, and I started to be really snobbish about it. He doesn't do this. He doesn't hold his fork right, or something like that. And you stopped me and you said, I won't say what you said, but you said I was being like somebody that we both know, which isn't good. He told me what was wrong. And rather than get mad, I was glad because he set me in the right place. So fellowship, if you're a believer, you can accept these kind of conversations. You don't have to be defensive. So it's again, part of being deeper with that friendship.
So let me ask you this. Who in your life, now maybe you go to a church of 1,000 people, so you're not going to have the same depth of fellowship with all thousands of those people.
Right.
So who in your life, maybe it's 6 people, maybe it's 12, maybe it's a small group, who in your life can speak the truth to you in love?
Not too many.
For some of us, nobody. Right?
I was trying to be nice, but yes.
And yet that's part of what fellowship is. Think of the Lord's relationship to his disciples. He spoke the truth to them in love. And so whether it's Thomas who doubted, and so instead of the Lord just saying, "You idiot, why did you doubt?" he demonstrated his hands and his feet. Peter, who denied him 3 times. Again, instead of Jesus just saying, I'm out of here, send in team B, Jesus walked Peter through his denials and said, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And that example of honesty and authenticity ought to be part of what our fellowship really is. And it's hard to get there.
Yeah, building on that again and kind of going back to what I was saying, where else can you have a relationship with someone where they're criticizing you, but they're doing it with love? They're telling you something is wrong, and then you can be healed from it. And if you're humble enough and know grace enough, you're going to be glad that it happened. Yeah. That's really strange to non-believers, but it's true. And your deeper relationship with that person, just as his disciples were feeling deeper with him because they had learned from him.
Yep. Again, I'm going to use the disciples as an example. You and I talk about all kinds of things under the sun, including cars and food and
watches.
Have you seen mine?
Well, actually, my new one. Oh, there's.
We love watches, yes.
It's stupid, but we do. We have them on our phones, but we still wear watches.
No. Phones are bogus watches. You're going to put a leather band around your phone and put it on your wrist. Anyway, so we do talk about all these kinds of things. And yet, there is sort of this foundation. I'll call it kingdom foundation. It's the things of the Lord. And again, that's why I'm going to go back to your church experience, whether it's your small group, or a fellowship group. There's a basis of understanding that this is about Christ. This is about his kingdom, both in my life and in our world. And the reason I say that is, if you think about it, true fellowship can have conversations about watches and cars and food. And yet this is the foundation. I'm afraid a lot of our fellowships have devolved into either just simple knowledge. I mean, it could even be Bible knowledge. Right. And then we've just become Gnostics or any other things. I know one of our small group leaders in our church came up to me some time ago and he said, we're getting nowhere with our group. I said, well, tell me about it. And it should have been a fellowship group of men. Every time they got together, they talked about politics. Oh. And they talked about how this guy's an idiot and these politics and this group and that group and the media. And I said, look at what you're doing. If fellowship is common life, which is what the word means, and your common life is politics or the enemy of the government, I said, who wants to be a part of that? Common life has to be Christ. Right. And it has to be what Christ is doing in your life and what Christ is doing in the world, which goes back to our original question. How is your soul? My fellowship with you, or with, I meet with a group of guys on Thursday morning, about 8, 9, 10 of us. We deal on our soul stuff. Right. And it's good for our souls. So if I'm dealing with your soul, if we're talking about the things of our hearts and the things on God's heart for you and for the world, that's the basis of our fellowship.
And one more thing before we go. I think that it's amazing that the way it's set up, you have, how is your soul? And the first thing is solitude. You really can't have fellowship until you've had solitude. That's right. Until you've learned more about him so that you can share with others, get the understanding, believe it in your God, in your heart, know the faith, know the grace, know all those things, humility, whatever it takes, totally. And then get together with those people and share that same existence.
Indeed. And I want to say, maybe we can start winding down here because this might apply to you. After all, you are either listening to us or watching us. Right now in this day and age, the fellowship of the Christian community, I think, is greatly devalued. Partly because of COVID. So the pandemic comes, and for health's sake, we can no longer meet. It's just about every church in the country that way. And for months and months and months, we can no longer meet. And so a lot of churches, including ours, we invested even more money and a whole lot of money into really good cameras and into a really good sound system so that you can watch us through live stream and have a really quality experience. Great. However, many people, and I'm not scolding anybody, but if you're feeling convicted, accept it. Many people have stayed that way. And so they are experiencing church in their bedrooms, between the sheets, with scrambled eggs with their wife. And every now and then that's fine. But as the pandemic subsides, it's time to get back into fellowship. Right. Fellowship is about interpersonal relationship. It's about 2 people, 5 people, 20 people sharing life together. And you really can't do it on a video camera. You really can't do it by a live stream. You have to do it in person. I mean, when God decided to come down and meet the needs of the world, he incarnated himself through the person of his son, flesh on flesh. And fellowship has got to be flesh on flesh. So I don't know where you are today, and maybe you're between churches, and maybe you've taken a step back from in-person worship. I would just encourage you to reevaluate that, because fellowship has to happen in the person of others. Jesus did it with the 12. You have to do it with other people.
So if I go to church again, can I still wear my pajamas? Because I was wearing them all the time when I was seeing them on Zoom.
If you go to church in particular counties in our state, yes, you can, and you'll fit right in.
With that, let's finish up. Next week,
service.
That's just as important, if not more, than these other 2.
Soul.
It'll help you grow in your love for him. Until next time, I'm Mark Pennell and Paul Sartorelli.
We'll see you.